Have you ever wanted to be completely transported into a book and experience the world through the eyes of a character instead of just reading the words on a page? If so, you might be in luck because that's basically the main thing in the Bookwalker Thief of Tales. Developed by a small Finnish game developer Do My Best, The Bookwalker is the second game to come out from this studio. Their first game, The Final Station, came out in mid-2016 to positive reception, and after playing The Bookwalker, I think I might give The Final Station a try since it's just been collecting dust in my Steam library for like 3 years. I don't know much about it besides the fact that from what I read, The Final Station is split between two types of gameplay which mirrors The Bookwalker pretty well. I also just find it impressive that in a world of ballooning AAA titles with hundreds of people on staff, these two games were made by two people. Sure, in a lot of ways such a small team causes limitations, but I think it has also allowed them to take risks and experiment with novel ideas, at least with the Bookwalker, which is usually a good thing. Speaking of which, I should probably talk about the story of that game, since that's what this video is supposed to be about. In the Bookwalker, you are thrust into the story of Antine Quist, an author living in a world where authors are king. Because of this setup, the whole structure of the world that we see seems to be based around authors and the books that they create. There are people that make rules surrounding the act of writing, as well as police that enforce those rules. On the flip side of that, there is a whole underground black market that has sprung up around books, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of people buying and selling books that might be banned or otherwise illegal in some way, it is the objects described in the books that these people are after. In order to get these objects, people called bookwalkers are tasked with going into the books and using their knowledge of the story as well as talking to the characters within. They will retrieve the desired object to bring into the real world. And Teen becomes a bookwalker out of desperation because he has broken the law while writing his latest book. Because of his transgression, he's been given 30 years of writer's block which manifests as unbreakable shackles that stop him from being able to write his own stories. Luckily for him, if he goes into enough stories for these shady black market individuals, then they can help him break off his shackles early. Now that's a cool enough story, and I do want to talk about it at least a little bit more, but it doesn't mean much if it's not fun to experience. What does it actually feel like to play as Antine and be a bookwalker in this game? Well, it feels mostly good, but not all that complicated or difficult. For a guy going through a pretty hard time in his life, Antine seems to have it fairly easy when it comes to gameplay, which means you're going to have a pretty smooth experience. Most of the gameplay that makes up the Bookwalker is also experienced within the books themselves, if you can imagine that. Some of the game does take place outside the books, but for the most part, it is usually just the place that you go into between levels. While outside of the levels, the game is played from a first-person perspective and you are stuck in your apartment complex. It is here you will pick up new books to enter as levels and where you will occasionally upgrade your combat abilities. While in this first-person segment, you will also talk to your neighbors in order to get items to take back into the levels, as well as viewing the apartment that you live in over the course of the game, seeing how your surroundings are affected by the ups and downs of your actions and the story. If I'm being honest, this part of the game doesn't really have much in terms of gameplay. It's mostly just used as a narrative tool and to serve as a visual contrast to the main gameplay that takes place in the books. And on that front, I think it works very well. When you are in these books, you're basically in an isometric point-and-click adventure game. Throughout the game, you are thrust into different stories, and while within these stories, you will mostly be using your mouse cursor to click around and talk to people while also solving interesting but admittedly simple puzzles. And I should know, because for someone who usually has a lot of trouble with puzzle games, I had almost no issues with this one. So after you have solved these puzzles and talked to all the people, you move on to the next story and do it all over again. But it's not all talking and solving. The different books do also have crafting and combat, but I have to stress that these aren't intense in any way, and I never personally had an issue with either of these aspects. For the most part, you're going to be crafting the same base tools to solve puzzles in every book, just because you can't take tools from book to book within the game. You'll find crafting materials pretty easily if you just click on everything in each room you go into. It's a cool way to encourage you to explore the worlds that have been built, but I would be lying if I said it didn't get tiring building a lockpick and crowbar for the third time in a row over and over again. The combat fares a little bit better in my eyes, if only because I think the way that your energy or ink is integrated into the world is an interesting mechanic. So basically how it works is when you are fighting an enemy, the game will switch over to a turn-based combat system. While in this part of the game, you take turns fighting different enemies using ink as your attack points. You also have attacks that are able to take ink away from your enemies so that you can keep attacking, or you can use replenishable ink jars to fill that meter back up instead. I say it's an interesting mechanic because your ink doesn't just refill at the beginning of each fight you encounter. Instead, it is something you're meant to manage and take into consideration, because outside of combat, you can use ink to make tasks easier while exploring the world. So for instance, if you aren't able to craft an item or a tool that you need because you didn't have enough resources or you don't want to take a risk with dialogue option, sometimes instead, if you have ink, you can just use that and save yourself a lot of effort in the long run. Because of that, it makes it feel like you have to play smarter when you're in a fight instead of using all your ink at every possible moment. moment. Unfortunately, I think almost all of that is countered by the fact that it is very, very easy to find ink in this game. I say that it felt like you were supposed to balance your ink consumption, but that isn't quite true. At least it never felt like that for me, because when you're exploring the world, every item that you find that can't be used for a key crafting item can be melted down to ink. Now, it did make it a lot easier for me throughout the course of the game, it's just that it felt like they had the makings of some interesting resource management that wasn't fully implemented. Thankfully, I don't mind something like that as long as the narrative and worlds of a game are still interesting. And since this is basically all I have to say about the game mechanics and the fighting within the game, I think I might now talk more about the story and these worlds a little bit more. I don't think the game would have been nearly as interesting if the books that you enter into had been such an interesting mix of familiar and alien, because right off the bat you don't know what to expect from each story and have to sort of figure it out as you go along. Without delving too much into the weeds, the first book that you enter does this perfectly by having you almost immediately stumble upon the remains of a dead Bookwalker, as well as a character named Roderick that is trapped in a small metal lantern that you can wear on your hip. This is great because it lets you know that the stakes are real, or as real as they can be given that the game never becomes too difficult, and you now have the companion to talk to throughout your adventures that then makes it a lot more natural to delve deeper into the psyche and thoughts of Antine. Think something similar to Kratos and Mimir if you've played the new God of War games. It's a great addition, and I'm glad they decided to borrow that aspect a little bit. But getting back to this first world for a second, the surprises aren't over yet. Although Antine is in this book, he has no idea what happens or how to get to the object that he needs to give to his black market contacts. That is where Roderick comes in a little bit more, because as you are playing, he is reading the book and is able to provide you with hints or information that you otherwise wouldn't be aware of. As you both trek through this level, you learn that everything isn't as it seems, as what started out as a medieval prison is slowly revealed to be a high-tech testing facility that is only meant to look like a prison. From there, you slowly start to encounter characters in the book that, although they are confused by your appearance, give you more information and context for the story that you've only popped into the middle of. And finally, as you make it to the end of the level, you are finally presented with a decision that will affect the state of the characters you've learned about and permanently alter their book going forward. It's a really interesting level and an idea because the stakes are relatively low, but each subsequent level builds on the ideas you see in the first one, as well as the idea of altering these stories for better or worse to meet your own goals. As you travel through these worlds, these different books, genres and classic stories will be more overtly combined, decisions will be harder and feel like they have more weight, and the story of Antine will unravel along the way as he gets to know Roderick and feels like he can open up to his friend during their journey. It's a wonderful story, and just from looking at what I've shown you from the first level and the snippets of others, you should be able to have an idea of if this is your sort of game. I don't really want to talk about the story any further than this because there are some genuine twists with Antine and with the stories within the books that I personally wasn't expecting. I think they should be experienced firsthand. So I'll leave it at that and wrap this up. While not perfect, I think the Bookwalker has a lot of great things going for it for anyone that can look past its shortcomings. It might not have the most cutting edge gameplay or the most complicated puzzles, but I would argue that you're playing the wrong game if that's what you're looking for, because the story is clearly the focus of this one. I mean, how could it not be when stories are at the center of the entire narrative? I had a great time hopping in and out of worlds while learning about a teen's past. It gave me some genuine twists that I will be thinking about for a while. If I had to say anything more about this game, it's that you should give it a shot if you watch to the end of the video. At $15 on Steam, it is a great bargain for the experience. And if you've already played this, let me know what you thought about it. Tell me down in the comments because I would love to talk about this some more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video very shortly.
No.